We're going to be talking about one of the large biological molecules that's also a polymer, and that is the carbohydrate group. First, let's look at what are carbohydrates in terms of their biological importance. Carbohydrates are like the fuel for a living organism. That's one of their primary purposes that they serve. In addition, they can also be a building material for a cell. And we'll look later at some specific examples of carbohydrates that are sources of fuel or building materials. When you hear about carbohydrates, this term can be used synonymously with sugars. So sugars are carbohydrates. But there's different types of sugars, from simple sugars to more complex sugars. So when talking about the carbohydrates, one way to organize them is by their level of complexity, which is whether they're made of just one monosaccharide, that's the simplest sugar, a single sugar molecule, or simple sugar, or if two monosaccharides are linked together, like if you go back to our previous lesson where we were just looking in general at the large biological molecules, and we mentioned that carbs are types of polymers, and polymers are formed through the process of dehydration synthesis. And we had the example of the fructose and the glucose combining to form sucrose. So sucrose is a disaccharide. Di refers to the fact that you've got double, which is from the two monosaccharides that are linked together through a covalent bond. The next tier up is more broad. It goes from 3 or more monosaccharides that are linked together. This group is known as the polysaccharides. So basically anything bigger than a disaccharide can be considered a polysaccharide. Okay, so now we're going to look at some specific examples of carbohydrates. First, the one that really gets the most recognition and we study more in this class when we talk about cellular respiration and photosynthesis also is glucose. Glucose is a monosaccharide. Monosaccharides you can usually recognize if you see their chemical formula, their molecular formula, as they usually are in multiples of for carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. For every 2 hydrogens, there's 1 carbon and 1 oxygen. So looking at the molecular formula for glucose, C6H12O6, that fits that rule. There's twice as many hydrogens, 12, compared to 6 carbons and 6 oxygens. As we'll learn in more depth later in the class, glucose is the major form of fuel for the process of cellular respiration that ultimately results in the production of ATP. In addition, glucose can be used as a building block material to build other types of carbon-based skeletons or other types of carbon molecules. So again, we're talking about, potentially disaccharides, polysaccharides, but it could also be outside of the realm of carbohydrates. Okay, so a closer look at disaccharides. As previously mentioned, disaccharides form through dehydration reactions of 2 monosaccharides. So here's that visual to show again the synthesis of sucrose from glucose and fructose. And I do want to mention a new term here, the glycosidic linkage, or could also say that's a glycosidic bond. I've seen both terms in texts that I've encountered while teaching this class. This is a type of covalent bond that links together or joins the monosaccharides, monosaccharides, because this could be in both a disaccharide or in a polysaccharide. So sucrose is an example of a disaccharide. Another example is lactose, milk sugar. Okay, let's take a closer look at polysaccharides now. Polysaccharides are similar to glucose in that they still do contain the potential energy to provide fuel for a cell to be able to do work later on. But because these molecules are much larger than a monosaccharide, it takes a lot more to access that fuel. So they are usually used more for like longer term storage for that potential energy, providing sugar for cells to again fuel the process of cellular respiration. And also again, we're seeing that other role of building material for other cells, for structure, for protection, for support. So I have some examples for both animal and plant cells. Starch is a storage polysaccharide in plants. So when plants photosynthesize, some of the food that they make is used right away to sustain their life processes. But some of that food is extra and they store it for later. And they do this in the form of starch. Starch is a storage molecule that they're housing that source of potential energy for later use when needed. So here's a close-up on the bottom left of a picture. This is a scanning electron microscope image actually of starch grains within a potato tuber cell, because potatoes are really starchy, as you may know, and that's, well, this is why. That's where the potato plant is storing its own potential energy or food for later use. So if you zoom into the starch and you can see the molecules, notice that it's this really, really long chain of repeating monosaccharides all linked together. They're glucose molecules specifically, and that's one of the characteristics of starch, to have that super, super long and coiled. You can sort of see how it's coiling. You don't really get the 3D effect here, but it kind of coils like a helix, single helix. And yeah, and that's the structure of starch. So animals don't store their excess food as starch. We have a different polysaccharide, and that is glycogen. Humans and other vertebrates store glycogen mainly in our liver and muscle cells. When looking at the molecular depiction here, it's very similar in that it's a bunch of monosaccharides covalently bonded together, forming this very, very long, complex structure. You don't really see that regular helical shape, but just again, know that this is an example of a polysaccharide, and be able to recognize the examples and which ones relate to animals, which ones relate to plants, and what their specific function is for the living thing that it's found in. So going beyond the role of the carbohydrates in food, like immediate source of food or long-term source of food, remember that another role that it can play is in structural support, protection. So we see that in cellulose. Cellulose is a major component in the cell walls of plants. Fun fact, it's also the most abundant organic compound on Earth. Here's a close-up under a compound light microscope of plant cells, chloroplasts, the little green dots, but I'm emphasizing here, for the purposes of this slide, the cell wall. So the main component of that is cellulose. Keeps the plant cell rigid, maintains its shape, protects it from things coming in that don't belong, or even things leaving that shouldn't be leaving the cell. Okay, so hopefully now you have better appreciation and understanding of the carbohydrate group. That concludes this lesson.